I'm PJ McKay and this is DIY PJ. Today on DIY PJ, I'm going to be taking a pallet and turning it into a chalkboard sign. I went to this warehouse and they had about 20 different pallets, and I came up with a way to use one of the pallets and turn it into a chalkboard sign. So after going through the pallets, I found one that was the best for what I'm going to be using it for. A lot of these are really flimsy, and the wood that they have on them is really distressed and not very flat. Whereas the one that I picked, the wood's a little bit thicker, and it's also smoother, so whenever I sand it down to put the chalkboard on, it'll be easier for the chalk to show up on this one. So I'm going to go with this one. This is going to be perfect. So now that I have the pallet home, the first step is going to be to clean the pallet, sand the surface to get it ready for paint. Once I sand it, I can put the first coat of chalkboard paint on it. It's typically about 3 coats of chalkboard paint before you can use it to write on. And then I'll let it dry and it'll be ready to use. I'm going to use some sawhorses to get the pallet up so that I can actually work on it. It'll be a good surface for me to be able to sand it. Go. So here are some of the tools that you're going to need for today's project. I have an electric palm sander. I'm going to use the combination of 2 different sandpaper grits. One is 80, which I'll use first, and then I have a 120, which I'll use second. The 120 will make sure that the whole surface is really smooth for the paint. I've also got a sandpaper block, and I've got some loose sandpaper. Once the table is sanded, you're going to want to wipe it down with a wet rag to get it ready for paint. For painting, what you're going to need is a paintbrush, a paint tray, a small paint roller. I've also got my chalkboard paint. So these are the tools for today's project. Now let's get started. So we're gonna get started with the electric palm sander and 80 grit sandpaper. Okay, now that I'm finished with the 80 sandpaper grit, I'm going to switch out and use the 120. Like I said, the 120 will give you a smoother surface, so I'm going to do a really light sanding with it. So here we go. Okay, so I just finished sanding the palette with the 120 sandpaper grit. It's got a nice smooth texture to it. Before I finish sanding, what I want to do is some of the edges still have some rough texture to it. I'm going to sand that with my loose sandpaper and my sandpaper block. I just got my palette sanded and wiped down with a wet rag. Now it's ready for my chalkboard paint, so I'm going to go ahead and put the first coat of chalkboard paint on the palette. Now that it's painted, it's time for the boring part, waiting for the paint to dry. The chalkboard sign is completely finished. Here are some useful ways of using it. You can use it as a calendar, a menu, love notes, to-do lists, quotes, and so much more. I have an electric palm sander. I'm going to use the combination, get several completed with this small can of chalkboard paint. The chalkboard sign is complete. And it's finished!